What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Healthspan Academy. I am your host, Craig Shearhart, and joining me today is my special guest, Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro, who is an expert in nutrition sciences. She first got her undergrad in exercise, sport, and health education from Radford University, and went on to get her Ph.D. in human nutrition, foods, and exercise from Virginia Tech, and was a former professor and assistant professor in exercise science at Georgia Gwinnett College. Went on to get her ACE certification as a health coach, and then got a certification as a nutrition with ISSN, and was also a researcher for Examine.com. She's the author of Science and Gut Health, currently runs a telehealth coaching business known as Vitamin Ph.D. Nutrition. And I could probably go on with a longer list, but I think that'll cover enough to get us started. Gabrielle, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I want to start with your career path, because it actually kind of mirrors my own path. I didn't go quite as deep into academia as it did, but I did undergrad, master's, worked for a few years as a research associate, went 3/4 to the PhD. I was like, okay, I'm going to try this coaching thing, and made that shift. Talk about that transition and how you ended up finding a home as a coach.
Oh, it was just a series of happy accidents, honestly. I realized when I was a junior in undergrad that I wanted to be a professor. And so I'm very I'm a focused person. So I'm
right.
If it's something that I want to do, then, full speed ahead. So instead of doing sort of a traditional internship, I went on to intern in the lab that I would eventually do my PhD in.
Cool.
So that was a skeletal muscle phys and biochem lab. And after that summer of interning, I also did one semester as a research assistant, like the lowest on the totem pole, while I was getting everything ready. And then I started my PhD. So it was, I kind of skipped over the master's, which you can do in some programs, but that just means that your PhD is long. So it took me 5 years.
Right.
So in that time, I also did a 3-year teaching fellowship and a certificate in pedagogy, which is basically like a scholarship of teaching and learning.
Right.
And from there, I knew that, I wanted to make a beeline for professorship. And so I ended up at Georgia Gwinnett, which is a small, 4-year institution. And it was fairly non-traditional because it didn't have admission requirements. And so it was open access like a community college would be,
cool.
But we conferred 4-year degrees. And so I really didn't intend to do anything with the gut microbiome research, which you should probably rewind and explain that was also an accident. I actually intended to study the impact of high-fat feeding on skeletal muscle hypertrophy.
Right.
And I was incessantly curious about some of the methods that we were using in lab. Because I wanted to know what it was that we were modeling, and what it was this phenomenon of metabolic endotoxemia.
Right.
So we were injecting rodents with like a polysaccharide or LPS, and then measuring the outcome in skeletal muscle. And I really wanted an opportunity to kind of get to the bottom of it, because I was like, if this is coming from our gut microbes, this LPS, I want to look at that. I want to try and prevent this process. And we really didn't get any funding for that for the first 6 months of my PhD. So I had a full, cohort of mice that I was running through on my high-fat feeding and hypertrophy study. Right. And then lo and behold, we got some funding from a probiotics company. And so I was put in charge of that project as sort of a side gig.
Nice.
And unfortunately at the time, but fortunately later, we lost the samples from my main project due to just storage issues. Put them in the freezer too early, or in the wrong tubes, I should say, and they tipped over. And
that's heartbreaking.
Yeah, like RNA storage solutions wipes off all the marker, and then you're like, I don't know what these. We can't use.
That's
these.
brutal.
So So thank goodness, I had that side project. So the probiotics study became my main project, and this is pre-2014, and people weren't really talking about the gut microbiome. It was just sort of a niche area.
Right.
And so when I finished with that, I was like, okay, great. Got that done. Got my PhD. Now I can do the professor stuff, which is what I really want to do.
Yeah.
And so after about 3 years of teaching, I was in the ISSN Facebook group, and Mike Israel from RP, Renaissance Periodization, saw me and what little content I was producing, and he reached out to recruit me to become an RP coach. Cool. So I was doing that, part-time for a year while trying to teach full-time. And it was rough. It's hard to do both of those things well, especially, the year before.
There's just no way to do that without being stretched thin.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So I was like, okay, I've got 1 year left to either get out like 2 publications in a really non-research institution and go up for promotion, or maybe I could, like we're kind of thinking like, maybe I could go this other route, and check out the coaching gig. Yeah. So that's what I did. And it was actually Mike's idea for me to talk about gut health, because there was not a lot of like evidence-based dialogue about it at the time. It was back in 2017. So I said, oh my gosh, I haven't looked at that stuff for 3 years. Yeah, it's not going to be unfamiliar. Yeah, so,
They ended up erasing all the information prior to that year. None of it actually matters anymore. We had to start completely fresh.
I'm like, but I pretty much crammed for my dissertation, right? Like, that's what it feels like. It doesn't matter how long you write, but So it was just kind of like that serendipitous, loss of the samples, and I studied the gut microbiome for, 4.5 years. And then 3 years after that, I get to speak about it. And it was really just a snowball effect, of invited to speak about it and eventually write the book.
That's very cool. I kind of have a similar story how I got out of academics. I had like 3 years of funding for a 4-year project. And then like the project started running low on money, and I was like trying to do mechanical testing on like knees, and they were giving me 103-year-old knees that are supposed to represent 30-year-olds. Literally, you could poke a hole into the bone with your finger, and I'm trying to drill bone screws into them to try to attach them to my rig. I was like, what am I doing? I'm going to get anything useful out of this at all. Those frustrate. It's just grad school life, right? You gotta love it. So, but yeah, it builds toughness. You're just like a glorified kind of lab rat doing your research.
Exactly. I'm like, why do you think I'm an expert in things? Like, it's just, years of trial and error, and then you come out with a degree, and they're like, okay, go be a professor now, or go be an adult.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I get a sense you get to do a little bit of both, still kind of with you still have a foot in the door with the academics, working with Examine. And like I said, that's been a great resource for me when I was writing my own book. That's was I guess my step up from Wikipedia. Like if there's something that's super fresh, Wikipedia is great, super lay terms, and Examine's kind of a step up in the kind of scientific dialogue. And it's based usually on secondary, I guess, research for the most part. Talk about how you got started with them, and how do you, when you're working for a third party, how is there strategies going in for that to make sure that it's minimally biased when you're kind of communicating that?
Mm-hmm. Another serendipitous event. So about, I would say 2 weeks after I separated from RP, I got an email from Kamal, and I had done an interview with them back in, I think, 2018 or 2019, just as sort of an expert interview. And, they asked me questions, and I wrote back, and that was really like the extent of my interactions. But I had always recommended them to my students when I was teaching, because I taught, sport nutrition, and I've always been big on, scientific literacy. Mm-hmm. And so he reached out and informed me that, they do some freelance work every once in a while. And I said, well, I've kind of got some maybe more like free time, as free time being very subjective. But I said, that would be fantastic. And so, we just kind of, we took it from there, and that would be back in, I think it was like March or April or so. So it's fairly recent, but they brought me on as someone to, primarily write around the topic of gut health, and then study summaries and things like that. So I think that we're all biased, but I think by nature I tend to be a sort of a skeptical person, and I try to look at things from multiple perspectives, especially like with my work in the middle of sort of like the diet, anti-diet communities, that, I want to determine, where a person is coming from. I want to, read a piece of literature, kind of understanding my biases and theirs as well. And then, as you mentioned, we're using a lot of like secondary resources. So when we're putting together a page and we're doing the human effects matrix, we're pulling from randomized control trials, to parse out the specifics of the data and the effect sizes. But when we're writing sort of the summaries, we're really drawing more from meta-analyses. Now, that being said, a meta-analysis is only as good as the articles.
Primary studies, studies they come from.
Yeah, exactly. So it's also, I think, just having an awareness of the limitations and working with a really fantastic team. Yeah. So there are people who are super strong in stats, that I can say, hey, this looks odd. I can't quite put my finger on why this seems wrong, but it really doesn't seem right. And look at this. And double check for me. So that's really helpful.
That's awesome. And I guess in nutrition, just because it's all over the map with like, what is the right answer? And I feel like that was my biggest pet peeve when I first started really getting deep into like the books in nutrition. It's like, here's an author, here's the method. This is the solution for nutrition that everyone must follow, like carnivore or like vegetarian or vegan or whatever it is. And I feel like we're starting to break down those barriers a little bit more. And that's what I love about your book is that you touch on all of them, but it's not like there's a universal solution for everybody. You really, if you want to get into coaching it, you need to be unbiased, and especially by like your own experience. So I think that's awesome.
That's good to hear. That was the whole purpose, to not have this be like, a gut health like fix or gut health solutions book. This is just
like a template. Which is here's just what the research says. And that's what I love about it. It's a great read. So getting into the book a little bit. And I've heard a little bit about this going into this kind of nature versus nurture, the genetics versus epigenetics. And the most fascinating piece to that to me is the vaginal birth versus C-section, which you touch on in the very beginning. Talk about how that alters your microbiome, not only after birth, but even like years later.
So it's still a little bit of a controversial or contentious topic because the early years of our microbiome are very tumultuous anyways. So we don't have a very stable set of microbes until we get to be about 3 years old. So there are certainly other environmental factors that might play a role. And one great example of this is the correlation between a C-section birth and the development of obesity later in life. That when that piece of information first emerged, people kind of glommed onto that and thought, oh, it must be the alterations in the microbiome. And that's, demonstrating a causal relationship between microbiome and the development of obesity. And then they realized that, actually there's this confounding factor of women with higher BMIs tend to more likely get a C-section, and then a maternal BMI also correlates with.
Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
So just something to put in your hat. But what we tend to see is that infants that are born via vaginal birth are colonized by vaginal and fecal microbes from their mother, whereas those that are born via C-section birth are initially colonized by environmental and skin-associated bacteria. And so what that can lead to is sort of early alterations in the downstream development of a microbial community. Right. And so then you have delayed establishment of what would be considered a mature set of microbes at a given age. And they may also, it also seems to be associated with increased risk of developing allergies and sort of atopic diseases later in life. So it's like skin allergies related to things. But they're still not quite sure why. Some of the theories are around this idea of intestinal permeability. So if they're colonized with skin and environmental microbes early on, that perhaps the permeability of the intestine is elevated or remains high for a longer period of time than normal. And then that allows for abnormal interactions between food-associated proteins and our immune system. And then we develop allergies later in life.
Interesting. It's just that little snowball effect, all those little connections along the chain. I guess at some point, maybe they look into like, we need to introduce other micro kind of organisms to these kids, I guess, that were vaginal births. Or is it still kind of too early to kind of assess that sort of thing?
So there is this really contentious topic. And I think in part, there might be some kind of like ick factor to it. So what some researchers have looked into is this practice of vaginal seeding. where they take a baby who's been born via C-section and they take vaginal secretions from the mother and they wipe it around its mouth, its nose, sometimes its eyes. And of course, there could be potentially a risk of infection or like microbes that, we didn't want in those areas. Yes. And also something else that I think is emerging would be awareness of the fact that babies, when they're born, are, to my understanding, usually kind of like face down. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just exposure to the vaginal canal, but it's actually exposure to the fecal microbe. Right. So, so people don't like to think about that, but it's actually, probably a little bit more of like the backdoor microbes.
Yeah, not the prettiest picture, but.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And there's also this sort of theory that, because we are more sterile now and, the babies are born into a sterile environment and whatnot, that they aren't exposed to as many fecal microbes as they may have been in the past when people were not super clean, and women would sometimes have a bowel movement, like right before in the process of giving birth. And so everything sort of mixed together and they're exposed in that way. So, I don't think that people are going to be like running out to practice that, but it's just something to think about. There are some different practices that people are experimenting with.
Interesting. Let's shift gears a little bit to when we have a little bit more say in kind of like our microbiome. So you talk about macronutrient balance and the impact there. And you had a really nice summary, actually, as a chart which talks about like balance of fats and proteins and carbs and excess and how that impacts you. Talk about the differences and when we can access, how that impacts the microbiome when we're short in that macronutrient. What are the cautions that we have to have if we're not in good balance with those macronutrients?
Mm-hmm. Well, these microbes require energy sources. Mm-hmm. So their preferred dietary substrate would be the carbohydrates that are inaccessible to us.
Right.
So indigestible carbs, most of the time we're talking about this, like as an umbrella term, we talk about dietary fiber. Mm-hmm. Not all dietary fibers are preferred sources for them, but most of what we're talking about would be like the fermentable carbohydrates. So if you think about like the list of FODMAPs, things that you get like beans and whole grains and fruits and veggies, those are the carbohydrates that they would prefer to use for energy. But they can use other sources as well. So they could potentially ferment amino acids. Fat metabolism is pretty rare and limited. Mm-hmm. So when you apply those principles, you could kind of like logically reach the conclusion that if you're eating a zero carbohydrate diet, that there's either going to be some loss of life in that community because there are some that really require those, or they're going to try to find some other source of energy. And so they can do that via the carbohydrates that are found in the mucus layer that covers our intestinal cells.
Right.
So when we put someone through a significant dietary change, in most cases in the literature, what we've been doing for a few years now is taking people and taking mice, putting them on a high-fat diet. This is like the thing. You take a C57 Black 6J mouse, you put it on a high-fat refined carbohydrate diet, and then you see what happens. So what happens in that case, generally speaking, is that we see a loss in bifidobacteria because they're a little bit finicky and they really do require carbohydrates. They're not as adaptive. And then we see a relative increase in the number of Bacteroides because they are a little bit more adaptive. They can use different types of substrates. And then we also tend to see relative abundance in some other mucin degraders. Mm-hmm. So and I'm emphasizing relative abundance. I'll get to that in just a second. But we're thinking about this in proportions. Everything's got to add up to 100%. So like when one group goes down, the relative abundance of another group goes.
Yeah.
But what we also need to look at is total microbial content. Mm-hmm. So sometimes what we see is perhaps a change in the relative abundance that doesn't line up with a change in the numbers or vice versa, because you're looking at proportions. But if like your whole pie chart gets smaller, then you can actually see like a relative loss of the total number of microbes, but maybe not see a change in relative abundance. Right. And so it can be a little bit confusing when we're trying to determine like what's the actual impact. Mm-hmm. And then, what are the clinical outcomes? Like what's the relevance to human health? How much does it matter if we see a change in the relative abundance of Bacteroides? And then we have to look into the postbiotics. So when they are fermenting amino acids, the process of proteolytic fermentation, that can lead to the production of some compounds that are associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So like P-cresol, TMAO is still kind of up in the air because we can see that with like increased, fish consumption, and we haven't really linked fish to cardiovascular disease risk. But that's one thing. And then, ostensibly this reduction in the protective mucus layer could be problematic as well, because that's sort of part of the physical barrier of our immune system.
Right.
And the other thing is that potentially if we are reducing the numbers of beneficial or neutral microbes, their relative abundance has gone way down. And then the relative and total abundance of a potential pathogen increases because it can thrive now.
Right.
Then it could potentially reach a level at which it could produce virulence factors and cause
inflammation or whatever. Yeah.
I mean, but that's all that. Well, most of that is like theoretical still, with the exception of C. diff. Take a bunch of antibiotics, kill most things off, then that's a big risk factor for C. diff. But when it comes to like dietary interventions, we haven't really seen that then translates to increased infectious.
Right. That's a mouthful to try to like talk about and then research like that. How do you start to differentiate? And then that's such a paradigm shift when you realize you're not just eating for you, you're eating for your basically the bacteria you're hosting. And it's like we're all pregnant with all these little miniature microorganisms.
40 trillion.
Yeah, that's hilarious. One of the things that stuck out to me in the book as well is the changes that we see with people that are dealing with obesity and their gut function. I mentioned it changes the level of basically the microdiversity, I guess. And how much do we know about where that's coming from and what causes that?
We don't know anything about the cause.
Fair enough.
That we know zero, but that's just because we don't have any like causal relationships established.
Right.
So this was actually a fairly new development when I was going through grad school. Mm-hmm. And there were kind of two leaders in the field. There was Patrice Tani, and his lab was the one that characterized this metabolic endotoxemia. So they fed people they gave them a high fat meal challenge, which I think was like heavy cream. And then they measured circulating endotoxin. There are really some significant limitations to being able to even measure endotoxin. So there's sort of like the question of whether we can actually do that as accurately as we think we're doing, how valid and reliable is that assay? And then another lab, I believe it was the Gordon or Turnbaugh, they were the first ones that utilized the mouse fecal transplants to suggest some causal relationship, at least in rodents, between the microbiome and the obese phenotype. So they took fecal matter from a mouse that was genetically modified and bred to develop obesity on a high-fat diet, and they put that into a lean mouse that didn't have any microbes. And then that lean mouse developed obesity. And they've repeated this, and they found that sometimes the lean mice increase their food intake, but other times not. And so that really suggests that it's not just about energy intake in rodents. So that translated to research that was trying to determine, is there a causal relationship, and sort of what are the mechanisms? Mm-hmm. And early on, they established what they called enterotypes, based on some assays that looked at people with, obesity and people without obesity. And they found that at the phylum level, which is very general, it's like comparing vertebrates to invertebrates, that people with obesity tended to have higher Firmicutes and people without tended to have higher Bacteroidetes. But when you bring it down to like the genus and species level, that makes really zero sense, because like there's the species and the subspecies are so diverse and so varied in the way that they behave that it's not a helpful finding. But that was one of the early things they tried to characterize, like, this could predispose you to developing obesity. So scratch that. That's kind of been debunked. But the theory behind this that sort of ties it all together would be that some black box selection of microbes releases LPS, or lipopolysaccharide. Mm-hmm. And that is, and I say black box, we know that like the kind of the general type that's released, but we don't know like which
specifics. Sure.
So that's released, and then it leaks out into circulation via the intestinal wall that is overly permeable. So this person has intestinal permeability or leaky gut. And so the LPS can freely leave the intestines and enter circulation. And when it does that, it binds to receptors of the innate immune system that are found pretty much all over the place. But in this case, we're looking at skeletal muscle, and that causes metabolic inflexibility. So basically, the skeletal muscle becomes insulin resistant, and it also doesn't fully break down. It doesn't send fats through the whole process of like beta oxidation and break them down. So you end up with these like what we call acid soluble metabolites, which is just like a fancy way of saying like parts of these fatty acids are still floating around, and this is causing an inflammatory cascade. And that is also, and then so that can happen in skeletal muscle. We see some, there's some inflammation associated with adipose tissue as well. And then, there could also be some dysregulation of appetite as well. So it's kind of like this whole self-perpetuating cycle, because then
chicken and egg.
It's exactly. Then the person, perhaps eats more. They increase the inflammatory tone in the body, and then that has a feedback mechanism on the intestines, increasing permeability. And so that's the theory behind what it's sort of implicated in the development of type 2 diabetes and the genesis of obesity.
That's interesting. That could be like a pretty breakthrough discovery, I guess, when we figure out what's going on there. That's fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about caloric restriction and intermittent fasting. Obviously, that's picked up a lot of steam, and it seems like I got the feeling that there's mixed results when we're seeing in the microbiome health. What are the factors that sort of contribute to that? Is there a healthy amount of caloric restriction or extended fasting, intermittent fasting? Is it too individualized to call? Like, what are the principles that you would use to coach someone through that?
I think part of the issue with trying to determine its influence on the microbiome is that there's really limited research in that area, and that we don't have sort of a standardized way of measuring the changes that have occurred. Because in some cases, when we're looking at the extreme examples of individuals with anorexia nervosa, they saw both elevations and reductions in alpha diversity. And some of that comes down to just like what method that they used to both sequence the samples, and then also like, how did they measure alpha diversity? And that's quite an extreme example. We don't have a lot in healthy individuals or anything in active individuals, the people who would like kind of be most likely to engage in intermittent fasting or restriction.
It's a tricky thing in research. It's like you only look at the extremes, and there's nothing for us like normal lay people to say. We're trying to extrapolate from the extreme cases.
So they're looking at like hibernating animals, and it's like, really, how does that translate to humans? So really like we kind of have to fall back on like the principles of microbiome and, assume and some of the evidence that suggests there's kind of a normal diurnal rhythm to the microbiome itself. So you fast overnight, and the microbes that need energy, like right now, they don't have it, and they're not going to thrive. And then we see, probably a bloom earlier in the day and later in the day as we go through the feeding process.
Right.
So, you can gather some information from that. It's probably a good idea to like eat during waking daylight hours and maybe not at night. And, when we look at the effects of caloric restriction, we actually have two factors there. We have the caloric restriction, and we also potentially have the weight loss, that's associated with the caloric restriction.
So what's really driving it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And we really don't know that yet. And so, and it could be, and it's not like the people are eating exactly the same foods as they were before in smaller amounts. There are going to be some dietary changes as well, perhaps changes in physical activity. So, it would be very difficult. Not to say impossible, it's something that we could figure out. But in most cases, when we're looking at these caloric restriction studies, there are other factors that could be potentially influencing the microbiome.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I feel like even in the longevity world, we're still extrapolating as much from mice as we are from our own experience, and like how much can we really trust this? But that's one of the interesting kind of, I guess, conundrums, I guess, with dealing with longevity. We can't test on a human for their whole lifespan. So
right, exactly. Yeah. And it's so hard, things don't, they really don't translate well in most cases from rodents to humans. And do exactly the same things, So when people are like, when are we going to do this study in humans? Like in most cases, probably never, maybe something similar, but they're like pretty gnarly what we do to rodents sometimes.
Yeah, no kidding. Cool. I want to shift gears a little bit into your coaching practice. I know that's done really well for you, and you've grown a huge audience on your Instagram. Give me a snapshot of a day in the life of your client, your first conversation. What type of questions are you asking? What sort of, how do you decide where to lead them when you first meet them? Or even if it's a good fit, how does that first interaction look like?
Oh, it's interesting that you say that. So the approach that I take working with clients is based on motivational interviewing. And so that is, you're probably familiar, but it's for people who aren't familiar, it's a specific way of having a conversation about the possibility of change. And so while I am guiding the conversation from a place of ambivalence, or like, I'm not sure what I want to do, to a place of this is the thing that I want to do and I know how to do it, it's up to the clients what that place is.
Right.
So I'm kind of like a travel guide saying, these are all the directions we could take to this goal. And let's have a conversation about what would be the best fit for you based on your preferences, your experiences, and your goals. So the conversations are preceded by a pretty extensive intake form that is asking people about their relationship with food, their body image. In some cases, if it's like a GI specific kind of consult, then asking them what they've tried in the past and how things went for them. So I kind of have two sort of like distinct approaches in the case of, looking at kind of GI comfort. My process is, start with, have you gone to a gastroenterologist? Like, here's making sure to refer out first and determining fit in that way. And in the case, like, is this within my scope? Right. But working with, a person who wants to either change their body composition or change their relationship with food and body image, that is much more, let's talk about kind of where you've come from and where you want to be, helping them to identify the dissonance between those places. And then what is going to be the most reasonable next step for them to take. So it's moving them from a place of just engaging with them, building that rapport and trust, focusing on what it is that they really want, and whether what they think they want to do is actually going to get them what they want, if that makes sense. So when a person says, they want to lose weight to be healthier, then the question is, what does health look like to you? How will you know when you've met your goal? And then sometimes it's that, I didn't have to lose weight to do that. Actually, I want to get stronger. Actually, I want to be able to do more pull-ups or hike or, whatever it is. And so
I love it when they make those paradigm shifts and like,
it's fantastic. And I have to say, like, in most cases, like, even folks who have come to me, to lose weight, they're quite often in a place of still kind of wanting to lose weight and change their body, but also that they've identified that the relationship they have with food and with their bodies and with
and the
dieting.
Scale.
Yes, exactly. It's not working for them anymore. And they just want to know, like, is there something else that, like, a different way that I can do this? Do I have to count macros forever? Yeah. And the answer is yes, there are so many different ways. And, and having conversations about, like, what it is that you really want out of this process, and what are your values? Because there's a large portion of my coaching that is narrative coaching. So it's coaching without specific goals. So when clients are really changing the way they live, it's not like we set out a goal for, a different dynamic with, with your coworkers or, traveling more or something like that. But that's where it can end up. But we have these mini value-oriented conversations, like in having to make a decision today, I can do that in alignment with my values as long as I know what they are. And then that will lead me to a better place than where I was a month ago.
Exactly. Just start creating those small wins. What is the most common sticking point you'd say you see with new people? Is it the kind of that paradigm shift? Is it switching them to like weight loss to like more of a functional kind of tangible strength or fitness goal? And then how do you start to approach that?
I really think with the with the motivational interviewing sort of spirit and like the comprehensive coaching spirit, I have really rethought how I state or how I think about helping people get from one place to another.
Yeah, you don't want to walk them into a corner, I guess, sort of thing.
Right.
Right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So even if I can see, that they are in a place that they're kind of struggling with, and I feel compassionate, and I'm like, man, I really want to help this person feel better. I can really see that there's some suffering here. I can't get them to change. I can't say, I really think that you should stop counting macros, because we as humans have a natural contrarian response to that, because we need to like maintain our autonomy. And so it's more likely that if I say that they're going to say, oh, I don't know, I'm not really ready for that.
Yeah, so you have to make them come up with the idea themselves.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So like things get stuck when we're trying to like get a person to do something, or we're, not approaching them with like sincere acceptance of where they are. Because we can even like ask open-ended questions and whatnot, but do that still in a way that's trying to like convince them to do something. And we get some resistance from that. And that can be a sticking point.
Yeah.
But I have to say, like over the last like year and a half, I've moved away from doing that. Thank goodness, because I was able to identify it.
Yeah.
But in the clients, I can see that there is ambivalence, because on one hand, they really want to feel more free and liberated in their food choices and in their movement choices, and they want to be able to practice acceptance of their body.
Right.
And on the other hand, they're existing in a society that's very judgmental and stigmatizes weight gain, and they feel fearful about the prospect of gaining weight once they stop trying to constantly diet. And so that's just about, accepting and acknowledging the ambivalence and reflecting it back to them, saying, I understand this and you really want this. And when they're talking about like, why it's important, pointing those things out, you really like, you would feel so much more relaxed around food. You'd be able to connect with your family more. And then also really affirming, the character strengths that they have that can help them get to that place.
Right.
And that helps them kind of move from that place of, I don't know, I kind of want to do this, but I'm really afraid, to like, maybe I can do this, to I'm going to try doing this. And then finally like, I did that, and so.
I love that. I guess that's a challenge sometimes as a coach, because you're almost removing yourself as the authority figure, right? You're like, you're giving them the power. And as a coach, you're like, oh, but I'm supposed to know all this stuff. It's like, you just have to literally let go of your ego and be like, okay, I'm going to let this person just ask the right questions and kind of get them to figure out what they need to do. And because they've, just got to give them enough information to make the most informed decision, I guess. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's sharing your unique expertise. So we as coaches, we have expertise in nutrition and training and gut health or whatever. And then the client has the unique expertise on themselves.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
Emphasizing that, and really like, when we are labeling someone as non-compliant or unmotivated or whatever, is that the case? Or did we just tell them to do what we think they should do without like acknowledging the real obstacles and actually collaborating on a change plan that would work for them?
Yeah. I love that. I want to circle back to your own personal habits. And that's one thing I've, especially in a pandemic, I've like struggled, that people have this image of this coach. You must eat perfectly all day and work out 7 days a week and sleep 9 hours a night. But obviously having to pivot in a pandemic and you're dealing with stuff yourself, we're dealing with our own things. So talk about your own priorities around your own fitness and health, and what your habits look like around those habits.
Sure. I would say I'm intrinsically motivated to exercise. So I just do it. I enjoy it. And so that has been that habit really hasn't changed much. I mean, the way that habit looks has changed. So there was a period of time when, I didn't have access to a gym and so I was like, stands, little dumbbells. But, I live out in Arizona and it's awesome 10 months out of the year, and the other 2 months, a little bit hot, melt, but, so I kind of transitioned to just spending more time outside and hiking and, and that was my form of physical activity. And now we have an in-home gym set up. So it's like super easy for me to go in there and train, and I like doing it. That's
great.
For me. So yeah, so I have that's kind of remained the same. And, really with nutrition, it's funny that you had mentioned, kind of eating for your microbes. And That's really my focus. I like to have dietary variety, and I eat plants with every meal, not out of like some sort of like rule or something like that. It's not even about like increasing volume to manage hunger, because these days, like when I feel hungry, I go ahead and I eat. But it's about, providing like dietary variety for myself, for the microbes. And I like the thought of, I'm giving them like all these different food sources, and
you're like your little children.
Yeah. Like hopefully that's supporting of my health, like something happens or whatever, like hopefully they're, paying it forward.
Yeah.
So, but I guess I don't have like very, concrete habits. I kind of have a rhythm. So in the morning, I go and walk my dog, and I listen to a podcast, and then kind of like get, eat and get into work. And then middle of the day, I know when I'm going to get hungry. So I take a break every few hours and I just eat. I ended up getting like a meal prep delivery service because I was so tired of cooking, and my boyfriend eats like so many, millions of calories a day because he works a very physical job. And I was like, I don't want to be cooking for 4 hours, and neither do you.
Yeah.
So it's kind of nice to just go out there and be like, oh, what meals did they send this week? Awesome. And so I feel very fortunate to have that. That's definitely a privilege to be able to do that. Then it's kind of like training later in the day. I do not have great sleep hygiene. We wake up at like, 5 o'clock in the morning, and getting to bed by like 10 is superb, because it's just hard to wind down at the end of the day. And,
I feel you.
Yeah. Cool. So I don't fit maybe that mold of like, get up and do my like green shake or whatever. I'm just kind of like, I try to just, exactly.
Yeah.
Kind of do what I feel like. And fortunately, I feel like eating a nutrient dense diet and exercising, and but we still like eat, we get cookies, like a cookie thing every week. And, so we kind of have our little, just
gotta live.
Stuff.
Everybody's got their vices.
Exactly. Just enjoy it. I'm like, I really struggled with disordered eating and exercise dependence for so many years.
Right.
And I can still remember, not being able to take a rest day and feeling so anxious about, someone making, making cookies or something, and, trying to connect with me. And I'm like, now I'm like, yes, I just want to enjoy it. Exercise fits into my life now in a different way. And I still love doing that. And, I still love eating nutritious foods. And it's great that now I can have whatever food in my house, and I don't feel anxious about having it. I don't have to freeze my peanut butter anymore. I'm just going to, I'm not going to eat a whole jar of peanut butter because that doesn't feel good.
Yeah. You can get a little too obsessive. Awesome. Well, Gabrielle, I really appreciate you sitting down. This has been an awesome chat, and we'll link to your website and how people can reach you in the show notes. And hopefully we can do this again sometime. Appreciate you sitting in.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for tuning in today, guys, on Healthspan Academy, and we will see you next time.